The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast, connecting Virginians to their government. We're pleased to have Delegate Ken Plum with us today. Welcome, sir.
Woody, thank you, and thanks to VCTA for continuing to do this, and especially Comcast back home. I actually do a weekly show with the Comcast cable system back home.
Great, great. Well, it's been a busy few weeks already. We're into the 45-day short session. I know you've had a busy schedule this morning. Tell us what's going on, especially in terms of some of the pronouncements the governor made in his State of the Commonwealth.
Sure. Woody, it's a short session, but we're not short of work. The idea a long time ago was that these interim sessions would be less busy, but that hasn't proved to be the case. We do the budget, of course, in the long session, but then we have to adjust it in the short session, and that's something we have to work on here. I was really delighted with the governor's report last week to the joint session of the House and the Senate. Governor McAuliffe is a man of vision, high energy, and I think is leading Virginia in the right direction. Already he's attracted in his first year $5.5 billion in capital investments in the Commonwealth.
$5.5 billion?
Yeah, and that's more than any governor ever has been able to do. He works hard at it. He's a super salesman. And he talks in terms of the new economy. And I really think we need to pay attention to what he's talking about, because I think he has some things going. We simply cannot build an economy on the way work's been done in the past. There are declining industries. We need to give alternatives where industries are in decline. The best example, of course, is tobacco as an example. What we can do to create new businesses in those communities, or alternative agricultural use for that land, whatever that would be. Coal is in a decline. It's a whole conservation issue and so on. And Governor McAuliffe has been good at going around the world, because the economy now truly is international, attracting new business to Virginia. But what he challenged us with, that I think we as legislators need to pay attention to, is that there are expectations of the government in a new economy. And that would be that we be an open and inclusive society, that we not discriminate. And Virginia has a history of discrimination in a lot of different directions. And we need to not be discriminatory in our practices. We need also to make sure that people who work in Virginia can get a living wage, a decent pay. Women can get decent pay. And that particularly, too, we have access to health care. That we're talking about is a progressive new economy that is inclusive of all people, and that people who work can in fact live on the pay for which they are working. It's an exciting challenge for us, and one that we don't do in one legislative session, but one I think sets us on the right course.
Now, you live in a district that's closer to Washington, D.C., and some of the ills that the state and the nation are facing are a result of the inability of Congress to come to an agreement, especially in terms of a budget. The sequestration has really hurt the state of Virginia. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, you know, we have been more dependent, although Virginians have loved to denounce the federal government and so on over the years. The fact of the matter is the Virginia economy has been highly dependent upon federal spending, not just in Northern Virginia, but in the Hampton, Newport News, Tidewater area as well. And as the federal government understandably and must trim back, that has a ripple effect back to localities. What the governor said when he talked about the new economy, and what I believe in, is we need diversification. Certainly the government offers enormous opportunities in terms of research and development, and we have lots of firms who are doing massive, wonderful things for the federal government. But we need also to look on the private side, in the private sector, and make sure that there's that balance. We kind of got a little out of kilter, probably more dependent upon federal money than we need to. So we got to get back in balance by encouraging private investment through establishing a new economy for Virginia.
Now tell us how this sequestration has affected your district. I assume that there are constituents of yours who are in the military, there are contractors who do business with the federal government, employees who are employed directly by the federal government.
Yeah. In my district in particular, we have individuals who are involved in private sector contracting to the federal government. And that, as that has been reduced, many of those companies, in foreseeing that this was going to happen, have already gone out and sought contracts in other areas to diversify their businesses. We are also a growing economy, so that in some regards the growth makes up for what you may have lost. We're not the hardest hit of the state, but at the same time we have to be mindful of it and be a participant as partners with the rest of the regions of the state, because anytime a region of the state is drained on state resources, it affects us all. So we got to make sure that everybody prospers in a new economy.
And of course you still serve on the Transportation Committee in the House of Delegates. Talk to us a little bit more about the diversification of the economy as it relates to transportation needs.
Well, my district I'm extremely proud of. We are a really good example of diversification in transportation. My viewers know that, of course, last year we opened the new link to the metro system, the Silver Line, and I've spent really 2 decades of my life. I organized the Dulles Corridor Rail Association, largely the advocacy group that brought about rail in the Dulles Corridor. We put together a complex plan of funding, because it's a multi-billion-dollar project. And now I can walk from my home through the trails, not on the sidewalks, through the trails. Trails are an alternative system of transportation. Walk to the metro stop in about 25 minutes. I can then ride the rail to Tyson's Corner. I go there for meetings, and I do that now frequently. Arlington, Washington, D.C., throughout the center of Virginia, Washington, D.C., into Maryland, without getting out of my seat. So it's a great new advance. At the same time, we have recognized that a number of people who will use the metro system won't get there by cars. In fact, you defeat your purpose if everybody drives to it. So that parking garage at the end at Reston Wheelie Station, as my viewers know, have a couple hundred bicycle spaces. And now we're looking at the increased use of bicycles and bicycle paths by our roadway, and we're looking at better defining the laws of the relationship between somebody in a car and somebody in a bike, to have understand who has the right of way and so on. And these are all viable alternatives. Walking is an important feature. Transit-oriented development says that you build your new development nearest the mass transit system. So at Reston Wheelie Station, 550 apartments are going up on top of the parking garage. And some people will spend their day by riding the elevator down, walking the bridge to the station, and taking the train to wherever it may be that they will be going. And by 2018, that metro system will extend to Dulles Airport, through Dulles Airport to 2 stations in Loudoun County.
Great, great. Now tell us a little bit about what's going on education-wise. I know the governor has some thoughts about that as well. And your background for 30 years was as an educator and administrator. And I know you have a great interest in that.
Woody, you're exactly right. And the fact of the matter is that during the depths of the recession, we made reductions across the board in the budget. $2.5 million, for example, out of the budget touched all programs. And now if you look at the per pupil spending for education, public schools K-12, that is now less than it was per pupil in 2007.
Less than 2007, wow.
That is an unsatisfactory situation. We have a growth in student enrollment. We have a growth in student needs. We have expanded the curriculum and so on. And we need to reasonably accommodate our teachers with a pay raise, which some haven't gotten now for years. So while we talk big things about public education and everybody's for it, when you look at the details, you realize we haven't really been doing the job. And so now we have to, over a period of time now, work out how it is that we're going to be able to reorder the priorities within our budget to bring public education back to a better position. At one time, the mix between the funding of public education and at the state level was 55%, 45% by localities. Now that's 40% by state, 60% by localities. So when people talk about their property taxes going up, it's largely the pressure on the local school budgets that in part has been brought about because of the decline in state revenue. The other thing that a lot of people, including myself, are really concerned about is the cost of college education. I'm pleased to hear the President talking about this issue and in fact making hard proposals about how that might be resolved. But it doesn't make sense to encourage people to go to higher education and say that's so important to do, and then have them come out with debt that they're going to be saddled with for decades. We need to do more by way of compensation. At one time, 75% of the cost of colleges and universities in Virginia, 75% were paid by the state. Now, about 25% is paid by the state. The rest is paid by student fees, tuition fees, contracts and grants and so on. That's all out of balance again.
So it's turned on its head now.
It's turned on its head, and it's happened slowly over a period of time. The economy's been tight. We had a recession. There are all kinds of excuses given, but the facts are before us on the table now, and we have not just simply to give good words about supporting education. We need some action to do that.
Talk to us a little bit about the composite index. I know that's something that's important to Northern Virginia and your constituents. How does that work, and what does it mean?
Yeah, composite index is a system whereby we try to equalize the funding given to education. If you're a very rich county, like I come from in Fairfax, in Northern Virginia, the state puts in about 20% of the cost of public education, and the localities put in the additional 80%. The number I gave you before is kind of a statewide average, but when you get down to a locality, we're primarily private or locally, locally supported, and that's the right thing to do in the sense that it ensures then that other monies for education go to counties that don't have the wealth we have. It is the case now, unfortunately, that there are counties in Virginia whose median income is 1/3 what it is in Northern Virginia. And those counties don't have the wherewithal. They don't have the local property with value, and they don't have the local folks who can, with property tax or with personal income tax or whatever, make up the difference. So in that instance, the state may pick up 80% of the cost. And that composite index is to try to ensure that everybody has equal access, as they should, to a public education. It's the right thing to do, and the Supreme Court says it's a thing you have to do.
Now, what about the controversy surrounding the standards of learning? There was legislation last year which changed a few things in terms of the number of tests that kids K through 12 have to take. And I know there's discussions going on about further changes.
Well, there was a hue and cry a number of years ago about how do we hold the schools more accountable. And of course, one of the ways you can hold the schools more accountable is to do some testing. That got way out of hand. Between the advocates who wanted to prove something about the public schools wanting more testing, and the test manufacturers who were willing to sell you as many tests as you were willing to buy, we got into a situation of where young people were taking 53 standardized tests. That took up valuable instructional time. It raised the stress level of even kids in elementary school. Parents were wondering what is going on, and teachers were saying, I'm running out of time to teach. Something had to give, and I'm really pleased how there was a bringing together of support with the parents, the kids, the teaching community at large, and we did make some dent in that last year. And we've had a study group working over the course of the year to see what additional changes could be made. And some changes are being proposed, and we're going to make some steps forward this session, I'm confident.
Another law that was passed last session, which drew some controversy, and I think there are bills in already to repeal it, was to assign a grade of A to F to local school districts.
You know, it's really not needed. We already know that some school systems, as exhibited by their graduates and so on, do a really great job. There are some schools, and we can know what the characteristics are. We can drive through the community, the very low-income communities, where children have had little preschool opportunities, where they have not had reading and books in the home and so on. The disadvantaged kids, when they go to school, they don't do well. So then to turn around and add insult to injury with an A, B, C, D, F didn't really add to the knowledge. And it came to recognize that while that nationally was politically popular for a while, Nobody wants anything to do with it now, so I think we're going to get rid of that.
And the other popular initiative that has run into a dead end as a result of a court decision relates to the ability of the state to take over a failing school.
Yeah. You know, I don't think there's any great mystery about how all this is done. It's not whether the school board or the state bureaucracy or the state school board runs the school. It's whether you resource the school. And are you talking money? Yeah, well, largely you are, because schools are about people. 85% of a typical school system's budget is in people. And so you have to make sure that there's enough people in a building to give the attentions needed to the individual needs of students. So in troubled schools, you're talking about a lower pupil-teacher ratio so that they can get the kind of counseling, mentoring, and instruction that'll make sure they improve.
So I think you hope that the General Assembly holds K through 12 at least harmless in terms of its current funding, as well as higher education.
And that, I believe, will happen. There seems to be agreement that this thing has slipped too much. And I continue to try to give attention to where the numbers are so that we don't get into an argument about whether adding money on top of money. We're actually adding money to money that's been taken away.
So does that imply that there will be less attention to pre-K, for example?
No, I don't see that at all. It's in terms, as you were listing priorities and you talked about education broadly, and you say, how is it that you would improve education? There's no better method known than to involve kids early. It's also been a number of longitudinal studies that have looked at children who had the opportunity to be in preschool and those who didn't, and what happens to them 10, 20, 30, actually 40 years later. You find that there's like an 11-to-1 return on investment by children not needing remedial education, not needing public entitlement and support programs when they get out, and doing better as good citizens because they had an early exposure to learning.
And I take it that there is a very significant hurdle in terms of whether our children read at the third grade level. If they don't, there are certain consequences that occur.
Well, it's kind of one of those key benchmarks of where it is that you figure out the child's going to be doing well. And if a child's not reading by third grade, and if the child has had exposure to preschool education, there's little likelihood that that's going to be a problem. But whoever it is at third grade who's not reading well needs additional attention. They need to be pulled out of the classroom, and in instances many times it's one-on-one instruction, but it's very important that you get that reading underway, or else you fail all kinds of subjects throughout and you never catch up.
And a number of those children unfortunately wind up in our criminal justice system.
That's where the savings comes, because if you have an successful education system, you don't have people who go to prison, you have people who go to work. They become taxpayers and contributing citizens.
We've talked about K through 12. We've talked a little bit about higher education, but of course, as you know, our junior college, community college system plays a significant role in diversifying our economy, does it not?
Well, the governor said as part of the new economy, we have to have workforce development that's responsive to a new economy and to the jobs in the new economy. And when you take a look at how that's done, community college is fundamental to that. Community college takes good instruction, relates it to the industrial manufacturing sectors and so on, so that people can leave community college and go to work, or, as is the case now, so many students decide to start their education at the community college level and go on then to further four-year school.
Matter of fact, there's a 2+2 program
2+2.
that basically virtually guarantees admission in one of our institutions of higher learning if you maintain a certain grade point average.
North Virginia Community College and George Mason University kind of pioneered that, and I don't know if it's still true, but for many years it was the case that people who started at community college actually did better than the kids who started at George Mason. They're somehow tends to be older, they tend to be mature, they tend to be good students. It's a good working system.
And of course, people always complain about taxes, but that's funded through a sales tax, is it not, the community college system?
Right.
What about adults who lost their job and the need to retrain them in this new economy?
Yeah, well, that's part of what the governor was talking about. Again, you don't have a good community unless it is the fact that you have people at work. And people at work sometimes, people who are not working, may have a set of skills that they can apply. Too many times they don't have a set of skills that will work in the new economy, and so that would would make a difference.
Now, I take it you also have a number of veterans in your constituency.
Yeah. Woody, we want to do all we can for veterans and make sure, and in fact we give priority now in community colleges and employment. But let me just add an additional thing that I think we need to do to grow the new economy, and that is raise the minimum wage. It's unconscionable now that people work full-time, still scratch to pay the bills. Are they going to fill the prescriptions this time? Are they going to pay the rent, buy the food? What are they going to do? They face those decisions every week. And we take a look at how the minimum wage has not kept pace with the growth of our economy. It's time that we raise the minimum wage. My bill is very modest. It raises the minimum wage in 3 steps over 3 years to get to the 10-10 figure that most people recognize would be a more acceptable amount of money. When we're talking now about not a state program, we aren't talking about any entitlements, any giveaway. We're talking about people who work for a living being able to take home a decent amount of pay to be able to pay their bills. And I'm working hard to make sure the minimum wage bill passes.
Well, why isn't the General Assembly more receptive to that? I've noticed a number of states have had to go to an initiative because they can't get it through the legislature.
Well, I'm going to cross my fingers that we're going to get that done this year. We did not last year, but I hope we will this year. Some argue that it hurts the economy because it takes money from business and passes it on to employees. My way of looking at it is slightly different. I say that when we give money to employees who are working, who then have an opportunity to pay their bills, that stimulates economic activity. That doesn't cut back on business. That accelerates the growth of business. And when you look at the stagnation of our economy now and try to understand why that's been the case, part of it has been the problem of the stagnant wages. There's another piece to this, too, that we need to be aware of, and that is the fact that there are some people who work for low wages who can now, when they file their income tax, apply for a credit. That credit is an earned income tax credit, and it gives them some break on their taxes so that we're not taking money from people who have trouble paying their bills in the form of taxes. 19 states now say that if you don't have enough income tax paid for that amount for which you get a credit, you can actually get a refund. Well, I've introduced a bill that would give a modest refund to Virginia workers. Not talking about an entitlement. We're talking about a program that allows people of low income to keep their money and spend it themselves. And it simply doesn't make any sense to have an earned income tax credit where people can't get their money back and have then social systems that try to shore them up. Let's let them keep their money and support themselves. They want to do that, and I think we should encourage them to do that. So I see as this new economy growth being that we pay people a minimum wage that comes closer to a reasonable living wage, and that we allow people who have a limited amount of income to get a refundable credit for that.
And of course, many of these individuals are heads of households, be they single women or fathers who are trying to support their families. Many of them, as a result of not being able to earn enough, qualify for food stamps, potentially qualify for Medicaid, for
It's
example.
unconscionable that we do that. We complain about food stamp programs and we complain about social service programs. Well, here's an opportunity to let people work. And so. The other thing we have to be conscious of, I think, in the new economy is those people who've been pushed to the back. I'm talking about women who don't earn as much as men. There's no good reason why women and men's pay shouldn't be equal for the same job. Secondly, LGBT citizens, they have been kept on the margin in our society for too long. Got to get over it. The young people I talk to scratch their head and wonder, what is the problem? And the problem is a bunch of old guys, primarily old guys, who are living in generations gone by, not recognizing that LGBT citizens are citizens who are productive, can be productive members of our society, and they need to be brought in. And we first need to make sure, as the governor did through an executive order, but we need to, generally through state government, to take away that discrimination. Virginia has a terrible history as it relates to discrimination in terms of race. We've worked to overcome that. We still have work to do. But we need to recognize that among those factors of eliminating discrimination would be to make sure we don't discriminate against women and we don't discriminate against LGBT citizens.
Now, if my memory serves me correctly, you are the longest serving member of the House of Delegates now. Congratulations.
Thank you.
You've seen a lot of different changes. You've had a lot of different challenges. And of course, one of the challenges that's still facing the General Assembly is reforming the ethics laws.
Right.
We've had an unfortunate circumstance where our former governor was convicted. Talk to us about what's going on in that arena and what you think is necessary.
Well, it's absolutely necessary to pass laws. Now, we would say that, well, people ought to be good citizens and do things ethically and so on. There's, unfortunately, history shows there are unscrupulous people who will take advantage of a situation, who will take gifts, bribes, whatever. And so we need to strengthen our laws, because for a number of years we went along as though none of that happened in Virginia, and then, oops, we realized here are some situations where people are going to prison because it did happen. I'm for the toughest bills we can pass. If it's no gifts, that's fine with me. If it's $50 limit, $100 limit, we just need to have it so that it's stringent, where it satisfies in the public's mind that this person's not somehow taking bribes or whatever. And we need a full disclosure system so that people know not simply how I spend my expense money that I get as a legislator, but how I spend my campaign money as a legislator. I serve in a public position. Some of this is inconvenient for me, but I make by choice to be a public servant. And part of the price I pay is full disclosure, and I'm for full disclosure. So the toughest laws we can get through the General Assembly, I think we need to pass. And should the General Assembly not decide to toughen up its laws, I think there are going to be local citizens who are going to hold us accountable for not doing that.
And of course, part of the debate will involve defining terms. For example, who's a close personal relative or friend?
Yeah.
What's an intangible gift versus a tangible one? And do you think a commission is necessary to guide members of the General Assembly?
Yeah, the definitions get really tricky, and there are smart minds working on trying to tighten those up. But the thing being is that over a period of time there will be questions that remain about, for example, I have gone on trips that I called an educational trip on renewable energy and so on. No business paid for it. I learned a great deal from it. I've used that knowledge in the legislature. In future times, the judgment on whether, for example, a trip or some other item might be ethical to receive can be made by a third party reviewing the circumstance, who says to the public, you know, there's no private money here with anybody who has a purpose that they're trying to sell something. It's not a trip. I read about trips that some legislators take that I find it embarrassing, that they go on trips that are purely for their own pleasure.
Well, thank you for being here, Delegate Ken Plum. We appreciate your service in the General Assembly.
Woody, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast, connecting Virginians to their government. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans.